Sitting inside a tank during the Second World War certainly seemed a safer option than being an infantryman on the battlefield. Sure, the added protection of armour was great, but it made you a big target for enemy fire. Because of this, many tank crews would fit improvised or makeshift armour to their tanks. But what were some of these changes and were they effective? In today's video, we look at the extra armour on tanks during World War II. If you enjoy this video and want to see more, hit that subscribe button. It's free and really helps the channel reach more history lovers like you. In the final years of the war in Europe, the intensity of German resistance began to increase. Allied tankers would be on the receiving end of not only advanced German armoured units, but also their anti-tank weapons such as the Panzerfaust and the Panzerschreck. So field modifications by adding extra armour to their tanks became a common occurrence. In wartime, sandbags have been used to stop shrapnel and bullets for some time, so surely they would be useful on a tank. Allied tank crews began using this process in large numbers in 1944. The sandbags would be placed on the front and sides in order to add extra layers of protection. For some US units, they even welded metal frames to the sides of their Shermans to compress extra layers of sandbags. But although it provided the crew with a psychological protection, it did little else. A German round from the majority of their heavier tanks could easily penetrate the sandbags and the armour itself. What's worse, it also added extra weight and put pressure on the transmission and suspension. General Patton famously hated the practice. You can see here an image of him having just chewed out this tank crew for their sandbagging. Logs were another common use of extra armour. They were readily available and could be placed along the sides of tanks. This would also be regularly seen with German armoured units too, for example here with this Stug. But the logs also had another purpose, as they could be removed and used for traction in boggy or muddy terrain. As far as providing extra protection to the tank, well, no, not really. Timber does little in the way of stopping a high-velocity shell, but what it would do at least would help prevent German magnetic mines sticking to the side of the tank. So although its extra armoured function was basically non-existent, logs at least had some usefulness to the crew. As silly as it sounds, concrete was used to cover tanks, and it wasn't as uncommon as you might think. The material obviously has protective properties, as thousands of bunkers were made out of concrete during the war, so surely it would add some additional protection to a tank. The issue though is the amount being applied was simply too thin to actually make a difference. A concrete bunker is usually several feet thick with steel rebar, so unfortunately tank rounds simply went through the concrete, which would crack on impact. Another major disadvantage was the huge amounts of weight added to the tank, which significantly slowed it down. Spare tracks were used by tank crews to repair worn-out or battle-damaged tracks. Some tankers realised that given they were made of steel, they would likely add extra protection to a tank if placed in the right areas. British and Canadian tank crews took a particular liking to this makeshift armour type. They would store their spare tracks in areas of the tank which had weaknesses, such as around the ammunition storage. But it wasn't just their own tracks. They would use spare wheels and the tracks of knocked out Allied and even German tanks, which they welded on to ensure they wouldn't fall off. This type of improvised armour actually had some stopping power. Depending on the enemy round fired, most tracks or wheels, especially if they were double layered, had the ability to deflect or even stop a round. This is mainly because they were made out of strong steel instead of the previous examples which broke up on impact. There are plenty of examples of both Allied and even German tanks using this practice in the war. The last example we have is actual tank armor itself. If a crew had enough time and the right equipment, repurposing the armor from a knocked out friendly or enemy tank could be removed and welded onto their own tank. Having a huge extra piece of armor was a distinct advantage, as in some cases it could double the thickness of existing armor. Probably the best example of this was the Sherman Jumbo, which was born out of these field conversions. Spacing this armor away from the tank also added an advantage, and this type of skirt armor plating can be seen on many German tanks and tank destroyers. Of all the improvised modifications, cannibalizing tank armor was by far the most effective at stopping enemy rounds. But again, it did have the downside of added weight, putting stress on the overall workings of the tank. Nonetheless, all these extra armor additions were something interesting about the history of tank warfare during World War II. Were you aware of this improvised armor? Perhaps you know of some others that weren't mentioned. Let us know your thoughts in the comment section down below. As always guys, thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that subscribe button if you want to expand your knowledge and join the growing Premier History community.